Try this for a moment. Explain where you're going tonight without saying a single word. No talking, no writing, nothing. You'll probably start pointing. Maybe you'll mime walking with 2 fingers or trace a shape in the air, sketching out a building or a road without even thinking about it. That instinct, reaching for your hands before your voice, might be far older and far more revealing than it seems. For a long stretch of human history, that may have been the only kind of language your ancestors had. So what did communication actually look like before words existed, before anyone had a name for a single thing in the world around them? And why does your body still fall back on exactly that method the instant speech fails you? Let's start with a theory that quietly upends the assumption most people carry around without realizing it, the idea that language obviously began with sound. Psychologist Michael Corbellis spent decades building a case for what's called the gestural theory of language origins. His argument, laid out most fully in his book From Hand to Mouth, draws on several separate lines of evidence that all point the same direction. Living primates, it turns out, have remarkably limited voluntary control over their vocal calls, most of which are fixed, automatic, and tied to specific emotional states rather than freely combined the way words are. Their hands are a different story entirely. Chimpanzees and other apes show far more flexible, intentional control over manual gestures than over any sound they make. That gap shows up again and again in one of the more famous chapters of 20th-century animal research. For decades, researchers tried to teach chimpanzees to speak, and it failed almost completely, not from lack of intelligence, but because the ape vocal tract simply isn't built for it, lacking the fine muscular control and vocal anatomy needed to shape distinct sounds. The moment researchers switched to teaching apes sign language instead, starting most famously with a chimpanzee named Washu in the late 1960s, the results were dramatically different. Chimpanzees and gorillas picked up dozens, sometimes hundreds of manual signs, combining them in flexible, novel ways no chimp had ever managed with sound, occasionally even stringing signs together in orders that looked like the beginnings of structure. If the barrier had been intelligence, switching from voice to hands shouldn't have mattered. It mattered enormously. Corbellis found more support in an unexpected place: the brains of living primates themselves. Neurons known as mirror neurons, which fire both when an animal performs an action and when it watches another individual perform that same action, sit in a brain region in monkeys that corresponds remarkably closely to Broca's area, one of the primary language centers in the human brain. That overlap suggested to Corbellis that the neural circuitry underlying language may have first evolved to support watching and mimicking physical actions, gesture and imitation, long before it was ever repurposed for speech. It's a strange thought to sit with. The part of your brain doing the heaviest lifting every time you form a sentence may be built on top of far older machinery, whose original job was simply watching someone else's hands and learning to copy them. Here's the detail that makes this feel less like abstract theory and more like something you can verify yourself. Watch how young children actually learn language. Long before a toddler says a recognizable word, they point. Pointing at things reliably and meaningfully emerges earlier in a child's development than spoken vocabulary does, and children who point more and more precisely tend to develop spoken language faster afterward. Corbellis argued that if human ontogeny, the way an individual develops, echoes even a rough sketch of our evolutionary history, that detail is telling. The hand may genuinely come before the mouth. Corbellis proposed that somewhere late in hominin evolution, communication gradually shifted, hands giving way to face and voice with fully autonomous speech, communication that didn't need gesture alongside it at all, only reaching its modern form relatively recently, quite possibly within the history of our own species specifically. Not a sudden switch. A slow migration, one capability quietly handing off to another over enormous stretches of time. So if gesture came first, when did the vocal side of this story actually begin catching up? That question leads somewhere unexpected, into the genome itself. In 2001, researchers studying a British family referred to in the scientific literature simply as the KE family identified something remarkable. Roughly half the family across 3 generations carried a mutation in a single gene, later named FOXP2, and every one of them who carried it struggled significantly with language, not just pronunciation but grammar itself, the ability to correctly manipulate tenses, plurals, and sentence structure. Affected family members had trouble with tasks as specific as converting a made-up word like wug into its plural form, a task unaffected relatives handled instantly and without thinking. It remains one of the clearest examples ever found of a single gene playing an outsized role in something as complex as language, a rare case where researchers could trace a precise thread from one strand of DNA all the way to a specific measurable difficulty with grammar. That discovery sent researchers looking for FOXP2 across the evolutionary tree, and in 2007, a team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology sequenced the gene from Neanderthal DNA, extracted from fossils tens of thousands of years old using techniques that were themselves cutting edge at the time. The results surprised almost everyone who'd assumed Neanderthals were incapable of real speech. Neanderthals carried the exact same version of FOXP2 that modern humans do, the version linked to language capability, not the version found in chimpanzees. Pääbo's team concluded that this variant likely existed in the common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, pushing the likely origin of this particular genetic ingredient back to somewhere between 300 and 400,000 years ago, meaning one of the key genetic ingredients for language was already in place hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens even existed as a distinct species. The soft tissue evidence backs this up in an unusually direct way. In 1989, archaeologists excavating Kebara Cave in Israel recovered a remarkably well-preserved Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small, U-shaped bone that anchors your tongue and supports your voice box, dated to roughly 60,000 years ago. Its shape was almost indistinguishable from a modern human hyoid. For years, skeptics pointed out that overall bone shape alone doesn't prove much, since even a pig's hyoid looks surprisingly similar to a human's. But in 2013, researchers went further, analyzing the internal microstructure of the Kebara hyoid, the trabecular bone architecture shaped over a lifetime by the specific mechanical stresses placed on it. That internal architecture matched the patterns seen in modern humans who use their hyoid for speech, not the patterns seen in animals that don't. The bone itself had been shaped, quite literally, by a lifetime of use that looked like talking. Now picture it, two Neanderthals crouched at the edge of a hunting trail 60,000 years before anyone would find their bones. One points sharply toward movement in the brush, hand flat, fingers together, the universal gesture for stop. The other freezes instantly, eyes tracking exactly where the fingers indicated, and something passes between them that isn't quite a word yet but isn't only silence either, a low sound shaped by a throat and a voice box built remarkably like your own, layered on top of a gesture their hands already knew how to make. That's the real shape of the story once you put the pieces together. Language wasn't switched on all at once, and it didn't start with the tongue. It began with hands, borrowed circuitry built for watching and copying physical movement, slowly joined by a voice box and a gene for grammar that were already sitting in place in a species most people assume could only grunt. Tonight, when you catch yourself pointing, gesturing, tracing a shape in the air to explain something words alone won't quite carry, you're not doing something separate from language, some awkward fallback for when your vocabulary runs out. You're doing the original version of it, the one your hands were speaking long before your voice ever learned how to join in.